Professor Sir John Curtis is on the line. Professor, thanks very much indeed for joining us. The opinion polls seem very clear that if Boris Johnson returns, the Tories will get wiped out less badly than they will if they put in either Penny Mordaunt or Rishi Sunak. What say you?
Well, actually, the polls aren't consistent, George. There are a couple of polls that point somewhat in that direction, but I can find you two or three others that basically say there isn't much difference between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak in terms of their ability to reduce the Labour lead. None of these polls, by the way, suggest that simply changing the leader would mean that the Tories were doing well enough to be able to retain power. So to that extent, at least, the differences are somewhat academic. There is a clear difference in the character of the appeal of the two personalities. Boris Johnson essentially appeals to those who voted Conservative in 2019, but is received with a fair degree of antipathy amongst those who didn't. Rishi Sunak, in contrast, just doesn't quite enthuse 2019 Conservative voters as much. Some of them are just still saying, don't know what I would do if Rishi Sunak were Prime Minister. But he is somebody who is rather more popular amongst those who didn't vote Conservative in 2019. So one of the choices facing the Conservatives is whether to go for somebody who might perhaps be able to revive some of their core vote from 2019, or to go for somebody who has a wider appeal, but somebody who will have to do further work if he's going to get on board some of the, well, not necessarily traditional, but at least 2019 Tory vote.
Yeah, I mean, the 2019 Tory vote was a very significant one, as you know, and indeed you told us. The Tories won seats in 2019 under Boris Johnson that they had never won before, and some that they hadn't won in half a century or more. So a strategy of trying to turn out the 2019 vote again, it's not a bad one, is it?
No, it's a question. It's probably necessary, but the question is whether it's going to prove to be sufficient. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, the 2019 coalition was essentially forged through Boris Johnson being able to persuade those on the Leave side of the argument, I guess they include you, George, that he will be able to deliver Brexit. And around 3/4 of people who voted Leave in 2016 voted for the Conservatives, whereas in contrast, the Remain vote was rather more fragmented. But the problem that the government faces now is not that people don't think it's not going to deliver Brexit. It obviously has done, though there are a few arguments at the edges, including the Northern Ireland Protocol. The government's problem now is that, one, there are question marks still about Boris Johnson's probity and ethics, but two, fundamentally, and the reason why they're so far behind the polls, is that they have just presided over a fiscal and financial crash. And as has been true of all previous fiscal and financial crises in British post-war history, as a result, this has cost the government dear. So the question, therefore, is not, is who of the potential candidates can begin to persuade the public that they're able to turn the economy round, an economy that at the moment the public blame the government for crashing. And they blame them so much that even amongst Leave voters at the moment, the Labour Party are ahead. Now, it so happens that if you look at some of the detailed polling about who do you think will, of the potential leaders might be able to achieve what, well, yeah, Boris Johnson is more likely than Rishi Sunak thought to be capable of reducing immigration. Though actually, while in office, it's not something that Boris Johnson was particularly successful at achieving. But ask people who's most likely to improve the economy and reverse some of the damage, then Rishi Sunak emerges ahead. So one of the crucial things also the Conservative Party has to think about is what is the character of the problem that it finds itself in. It's certainly not the same problem as in 2019, when Boris Johnson undoubtedly salvaged the party's position, which at that stage was also pretty dire when he became Prime Minister. It's very different circumstances. The problem it faces is very different. And therefore, you have to ask yourself which of the potential candidates perhaps is going to be better able to mitigate the damage that's been done over the last 4 weeks to the Conservatives' reputation for running the economy.
Isn't Sunak Gordon Brown to Tony Blair? Isn't he John Major to Margaret Thatcher? Doesn't he essentially lack the kind of X factor that you require when you're in a bad situation like this? I mean, if the Tories were sailing along with a commanding lead in opinion polls, you might not need that X factor. You might be able to settle for a John Major. But Sunak has all the charisma of a wet lettuce, doesn't he?
Yeah, there's in fact quite a remarkable similarity between Rishi Sunak and Gordon Brown, in that, you know, they're both ex-chancellors and both very much details people. They're very good at mastering their particular brief, particularly the financial brief. You know, both of them in their different ways had developed expertise in the area. And undoubtedly, one of the weaknesses about Rishi Sunak that was exposed in the leadership contest with Liz Truss was his inability to be able to summarize what he was about in the matter of a few words. There was no strapline. We knew what Liz Truss was in favor. It was tax cuts and no handouts, although in the end she was forced into the handouts in the form of the energy price guarantee. But Rishi Sunak, you know, very much better than Liz Truss at mastering the detail, but very weak at presenting a broad strategic vision. And I think undoubtedly that's one of the areas where Mr. Sunak is at his weakest. Now, of course, it so happens that his opponent, Sir Keir Starmer, is also not somebody with a great deal of charisma, and so far has also not been somebody who's been very good at encapsulating in a relatively few number of words what kind of country he wants to create. So to that extent, at least, Mr. Sunak's weakness complements that of Sir Keir Starmer. And perhaps as a result of that, it may not be quite so serious. But yeah, I think undoubtedly this is the principal question to be asked about Mr. Sunak. Can he develop an ability to persuade people that he knows what kind of country he wants and can give them some semblance that he's on that particular journey?
It is a tantalizing prospect that you temporarily dangle in front of me there. The bore fest of Rishi Sunak versus Sir Keir Starmer. There must be room for someone like me to come through the middle there, John. But let's face it, if there is a ballot, because Boris Johnson might be lying for the first time in his life, he may not have 100 nominators, but if there is a contest, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? The party members go for Boris.
Well, the honest answer to you, George, is that we don't know, because no poll of Tory members has been conducted since Liz Truss resigned. We had 3 polls just before she resigned of Tory members, all of which showed that a minority of those people who had voted for Liz Truss had now changed their minds and were saying that they would vote for Rishi Sunak if that contest were run again. Also showed that a majority thought she should go. So certainly, you know, in a competition with Liz Truss now, Mr. Sunak, you know, unsurprisingly, would be the winner. Now, one of those polls did then go on to ask people, who is your preferred candidate? Well, yes, Boris Johnson was ahead. He had about 36%, Rishi Sunak about 23%. But there you have to bear in mind that actually there was a whole litany of candidates presented to people. So a lot of people were saying Ben Wallace, who isn't standing, Penny Mordaunt, who probably won't get on the ballot, Jeremy Hunt, who isn't standing. And of course, we don't know, therefore, how the many people who expressed preferences for other candidates would shape. And actually, when in that same poll, people were asked, well, do you think that Mr. Johnson will make a good or a bad replacement? Do you think Mr. Sunak will make a good or bad replacement? Well, Boris Johnson got 63% saying he'd make a good replacement, but Rishi Sunak got 60% saying he would make a good replacement. And what's intriguing about that is that pretty much everybody who voted for Rishi Sunak thought that Rishi Sunak would be a good replacement. Boris Johnson's support and those who think he'll make a good replacement are primarily those people who voted for Liz Truss, but it's only 3/4 of the people who voted for Liz Truss who were of that view. Now, also bear in mind, Rishi Sunak in the end didn't do as badly as the polls anticipated. He got 42% of the vote last time. So he doesn't have to go up that much on what he achieved. And it's also pretty clear that he gained ground during the campaign. Now, there are lots of ifs and maybes here, but I think the first thing just to realize is that, yes, I mean, the only chance of Boris Johnson winning is if indeed he gets on the ballot to with the members. I think that's very much clear. He might well do it, but whether he will do it, I think, is to a fair degree uncertain, because I think there are a couple of other things to bear in mind. One is, it's pretty clear now that what Rishi Sunak has managed to do is he's managed to fragment the ardent Brexiteer right wing of the Conservative Party. He has got people like Steve Baker, Kemi Badenoch, and even Suella Braverman, arch anti-migrant former Home Secretary, to back him, which are people you would otherwise expect to promote a candidate of the right, which is where effectively Boris Johnson is coming from now. So that's one consideration. And Kemi Badenoch in particular is pretty popular with the membership. We know that from what happened in the summer. And then the second thing we have to ask ourselves is this. Well, let's say for the purposes of argument, and we don't know what the numbers would be, but it's not inconceivable that Rishi Sunak might well beat Boris Johnson in the indicative vote, which we did not have last time, by around 2-1. So then the question is, given that view expressed by the parliamentary party, will the membership simply go with their enthusiasm, or will some of them hold back and say, well, hang on, if that's really where the MPs are at, I can see that Mr. Johnson's going to have a wee bit of trouble. And of course, what's also true is that the last 24, 36 hours, I've seen everybody being reminded about the fact that Mr. Johnson is still potentially in trouble over Partygate, and that he might be thrown out of the House of Commons by a combination of the Privileges Committee and his own and the voters in his own Uxbridge constituency, if in the end the Privileges Committee suggests he has misled the House of Commons over Partygate and suspend him for more than 8 days. So, all of those are considerations that we weren't necessarily talking about a week ago, but maybe before Conservative members by Tuesday. And if they are, I'm not sure that even a vote of the membership will necessarily go in Mr. Johnson's favour.
Very interesting. Now, you're far more than a pollster, of course. You're a constitutional scholar. What do you make of the argument advanced by Zach Goldsmith, Lord Goldsmith, that it would be unavoidable to call a general election if a third prime minister a new prime minister were to be chosen on a mandate won in 2019 by Boris Johnson? And that he didn't say so, but I know that he meant you really have only one way of avoiding an early general election, and that is to return the rightful owner of the seat, Boris Johnson. Then you can say we've already got a mandate and we're merely carrying it out. What do you make of that argument? Sustainable or not?
Well, it's certainly an argument that those on the Boris Johnson side of the camp are articulating. I mean, surprise, surprise, because it's an argument that helps to provide a justification for returning Mr. Johnson to office. I mean, the boring constitutional position is that we don't have a presidential system. We have a parliamentary system, and somebody can remain prime minister for so long as they maintain the confidence of the House of Commons. Mr. Johnson was turfed out at the beginning of July. Well, actually, just quite simply because his government collapsed. Mr. Johnson, by the beginning of July of this year, was unable to form an administration. And frankly, there might well be a question mark about Mr. Johnson's ability to form an administration, and certainly a stable one, even if he were to win the members' ballot. Why was Liz Truss brought down? Well, essentially because the chairman of the 1922 committee said, well, if you don't resign, I'm going to have to hold a ballot and you're going to lose. So again, effectively, she had lost the confidence of the House of Commons. And that constitutionally is how our system works. Now, we can argue the merits of all of this, but it's also worth bearing in mind that actually a majority of prime ministers in post-war British politics have become Prime Minister for the first time, not as a result of winning an election, but as a result of a change of horses in the middle of a parliament. So to that extent, at least, we frankly shouldn't be that surprised that this happens, because it happens more often than it does the new prime ministers winning an election. Now, that said, what you can say is that while changing a horse once in midstream is pretty common, changing a horse twice isn't. And sure, the last time this happened was in the 1935 to 1945 Parliament, when Winston Churchill was the third prime minister of that parliament. But of course, that was because the parliament had been extended as a result of the war. Before that, you have to go back to the middle of the 19th century. So you can, at that extent, you can say it's unprecedented. But constitutionally, it's what the British Constitution is, what any parliamentary system says. If you can find, so long as you can find a government that can maintain the confidence of the House of Commons within the current House of Commons as currently constituted, then our constitutional system says that's fine. It's only if we reach a situation where the Conservative Party is unable to find a successor who is able to maintain the confidence of the House of Commons. And, you know, that is the doubt that we all have. But it's only if that circumstance arises that then it would be clear that an election should be held. But unless that does happen, constitutionally, it is possible.
So, John, finally, and I'm grateful for your time and wisdom as always, can the Conservatives conceivably split over this? My take, admittedly, I don't meet as many Conservatives, perhaps as I should, but my reading of right-wing social media and punditry and so on is that if Sunak is the new Prime Minister, there are many Conservatives who simply won't wear it for a whole variety of reasons. And that some kind of realignment, some kind of SDP moment might occur on the right of British politics. In other words, a truly Conservative party and a kind of centrist Sunak Conservative party. Is that a possibility, do you think?
Well, certainly one of the questions we are asking ourselves, which I kind of alluded to in my last answer, is whether or not any of the candidates can bring the Conservative Party back together. It's pretty clear that if Mr. Johnson wins the contest, there are some MPs who will not be willing to support his administration and may well resign for the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And as a result of that, if that happens in large numbers, the Conservatives will lose their majority. And sure, I think there are people who will find it very difficult to be reconciled to Mr. Sunak. Now, you have to consider, however, what might happen. Now, in the case of those who might object to a Johnson premiership, they do perhaps potentially might have a home to go to, i.e. some of them might make the same journey as some did when Boris Johnson threw out the Remainers in 2019, which is to try to move in the direction of the Liberal Democrats, which may or may not give Sir Ed Davey's party a bit of a boost. It didn't do much in the end for them after 2019. On the other hand, if Mr. Sunak is the leader, where do those on the right go? Well, Mr. Farage is kind of jumping up and down again and saying, maybe I need to go back into politics. And maybe some of them might want to go into the Brexit party. But here we get into the fact that, of course, the right of the Conservative Party really consists of two very different groups. There are those like Suella Braverman, who are basically concerned to reduce immigration and who see Brexit as a way of implementing a form of economic nationalism. You know, we make things in Britain wherever possible. But there is the other wing, which is what Liz Truss was trying to articulate, which is global Britain. We deregulate. We become Singapore on Thames. We reduce the protection of workers. We go for a smaller state. That's always been a tension inside the Leave movement. We've just seen one side try to pursue that path and crash and burn. But it's not clear. But it's not clear to me that they, now very badly defeated, would find anything like the Reform UK as a particularly congenial home at the moment. So,
John Curtis, as always, much obliged. Thanks for joining us on the mother
welcome.
of all talk shows.